Gosh, great. Lots of people, lots of people. I just want to get this started. Lots of you may know me. My name's Audrey Wilson and I am the Partnership and Engagement Manager at the Scottish Council and Archives. And I also lead on creating a Community Archives Heritage Group Scotland network. But before I say any more, today is going to be recorded. So please note that if you contribute to the chat or if you contribute during the open session, it will be available for public consumption. So you may want to turn off your camera or you may want to leave if you feel inclined. Hope not. So also because this is an online event, there is a risk of unwanted guest sharing inappropriate content during the session. I want to reassure you that we have measures in place to reduce that risk, but if at any point we feel there is a threat, we will remove individuals, and if it's appropriate, we might even end the session, but that's never happened, so let's not worry about that. So Robert, if you've not already, can you hit the record button? Yeah, I think no one's left us. Great. So good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, generously supported by Queer Heritage and Collection Network. And today's webinar will be fairly interactive with Mentimeter polls, and I also suggest you have a pen and paper ready for a bit later on today. It will provide archivists and anyone working in the wider heritage sector the skills and confidence to develop their own outreach projects, to record and also to celebrate queer communities. And there'll be plenty of time for discussion at the end of the session. We've got about 25 minutes ready for that. So a little bit about OurStory Scotland. It's a community history and oral history project founded in 2002 to record the histories of Scotland's LGBTQ+ communities. We will be joined by its founder, Jaime Valentine, and Dom Miller-Graham, who is now the current chair. I am not going to say very much more at this point. I'm going to be here throughout the day, but please have a quick look at your Zoom screen. You can see the chat bar. You can click on that and you can add questions to it. But also, if you want to ask your own question, you can go to reactions and you can raise a virtual hand, or you can just raise a hand like this and I'll look out for you and I can unmute you and you can ask your own question. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Dom.
Hello, everyone. Thank you all for coming. I've got the chat box open as well, so if I see any questions, I'll try and answer them as we go along. My pronouns are they, he. Me and Jaime are OurStory Scotland. We collect, archive and present the lived experience of Scotland's LGBTQI+ community. Today, we're going to do a little Mentimeter presentation with me. I want to hear and learn about you and about what you want to hear from us. Then we're going to hear from Jaime about the origins and some of the history and early work, which is going to easily loop into the future that I'm going to be talking about. But in between that, you're going to have a wee 10 minutes Q&A if you want with Jaime. Then it's back to me, and I'm going to maybe talk from maybe just pre-COVID to today, and a couple of the projects and partnerships that we're doing, kind of what they look like,
right.
They take. Someday.
We'll do really.
But before that, I think we'll just get on with.
And thank you for the.
Oh, that's everyone's muted. Thank you. We'll get on with the first Mentimeter. So to begin with, I want you to pick up your smartphone, or you can open another window on your computer, and on the screen you'll see, if it works, ta-da! At the top of the screen, it tells you where to go and which number to put in. Easy peasy. If you need help, ask Audrey, not me. Ask Audrey. So I'm just basically wanting to know who we're talking to, who's making up the audience, how do you fall? Oh, lots of archivists already. How do you fall in this, these sections, these demographics? Lovely. other works. You could fall into the bracket of civilians. I'm a civilian. Lots of archivists, always good. Lovely to see. 3 civilians, good. Oh, my heart rate's going more. It's like a little competition. Who's going to win? Archivists are way in the lead. Like a little horse race. Before for researcher. Civilian then, civilian. This is usually where people fall, sort of the glam audience, galleries, libraries, all the rest of them, lovely people. Everyone's introducing themselves, lovely. Good. Public libraries, good. We do lots of exhibitions in libraries, lots of contact in libraries, love libraries. Excellent hub for lots of communities. The participation manager will tell you that. Excellent. I think that's everyone. That's all? Looks like it. Quick maths. Archivist. Lovely. Right, we'll move on to the next one. How confident are you? Because this is what we mostly do, collect, archive, and present. And where do you fall in this? How confident are you in these 3? You should answer them all. Good. Lovely, lots of storytellers, lots of people putting on exhibitions, lots and lots and lots of this.
Hello, Swan. Hello, baby.
Somebody's talking to a baby or a dog, I think, which is fun. I have cats and they will probably join us at some point, so you'll meet that. Archivist, outreach archivist in the Netherlands, lovely. That's interesting. So many people really, really confident in presenting. Fabulous. Wonderful. Right. Next one. This is a joke. Feel free to judge me. I did these. So, are you LGBTQI+? Are you in the community? Aye. Wonderful. Good. Fun. Well, lots of LGBTQI+ archivists as well then. Wonderful. That sort of makes sense in my brain for how comfortable we are in presenting as well. That kind of makes sense to me. Wonderful. Right. Right, to kind of look at the broadness of that, the communities within our community, and we have to, and it's sometimes you'll be nodding your head, I hope, that we often think LGBTQ plus queer people are just white, male, upper class, all these things. Cool. Fall into many of these myself. That's interesting, the storytelling. So do you feel, looking at that screen, that the stories of LGBTQ neurodivergent people are told a lot? Do you hear those narratives? Do you hear those stories? And that's interesting for people who are so comfortable in presenting these stories. The numbers here, that's interesting to me. I hope people are nodding. I'd love to see some faces at some point. Good, that's for later on. Right, fabulous. That's very, very helpful. How do you feel about that. That was good. So that was very, very interesting for me. That helps us guide what points we'll raise in the next few bits. Make sure that you get your boxes ticked and we know who we're talking to. And that's wonderful that my jokes will land with this audience. So that's the bit that I'm most excited about. But I'm going to hand you over to Jaime, and Jaime is going to give you a whistle-stop tour of the origins and really a lot of the work that we still do today, really. And I'll move just now. There you go, Jaime.
Can you hear me, everybody? Yes? Good. The first thing I want to say is, looking through what Dom has just done, I am the only person here who is over 50. And when I began this, I was over 50. And that was 20 years ago. So that really puts a kind of intergenerationality is what we're into. And this is definitely part of it. The context for this is the nature of our organization, which started in 2002 officially, but the beginnings of it are the year before, 2001. And we were then, and we still are, a group of volunteers. And that's all. So everything that we do is voluntary. We do what time we can, and none of us have are paid staff at all. So that gives you some kind of context. So that's true of Dom. It's also true of somebody else who is here today. I won't identify her, but one of you also is part of that. I'm smiling at you now, although you can't see that. We started in 2001 with a question. As I had just turned 50, I realized that I soon might be able to get early retirement, and I was looking for something a bit different to do. And I joined a group in Glasgow, at the Glasgow LGBT Centre. It was the second centre in Glasgow. They had one in Sauchiehall Street before. This was one in Dixon Street in Glasgow. And the group was called Diverse Artists. Who wouldn't want to be part of a group called Diverse Artists? Absolutely fab. Maybe Diverse Archivists, that would be another possibility. But anyway, this was called Diverse Artists. And we had had about 6 months of exchanging stories, doing it in a fairly arty and poetic way, and doing live storytelling and so forth. But it struck me there was a lot of people whose stories were not being heard. And I asked a simple question at the last meeting of 2001, which is, who is collecting the stories of the LGBT? Well, at that time, we didn't have Q+, so LGBT community in Scotland. And the answer was that nobody thought that it was happening. So they basically said, why don't you find out? So we set up a subgroup of diverse artists, which wasn't called Diverse Archivists, but it was called the Archive Group. And they said, why don't you go off and find out if anybody's doing this and how you would go about doing this. And so for more or less the next year, I went around trying to find this out. And that question that we asked, who is collecting the stories, is presumably a question that is also facing a lot of you. It's a question where you will try to find out, is anybody else in my particular place where I am, is anybody collecting those stories? And as I was in Scotland, I wanted to find out if this was happening anywhere in Scotland. At the time, it seemed there wasn't. It's also, as I look back on it, it's a classic case of archivist panic, because you think, gosh, there's all these stories, they're about to disappear. And archivist panic is when you realize there's something precious, which is there, which you may not have a chance to have in a future occasion. And if you don't archive it now, it's going to go. And that's exactly what we felt. And we felt it partly because there were a lot of people who'd seen the massive changes in Scottish society that had occurred up to that point, and who were not going to be around with us that much longer. We were very aware of people in their 70s, even in their 80s, who clearly were not going to be around much longer. And we wanted to make sure that we captured their stories, and nobody else seemed to be doing this. There was also the fact that Scotland itself had changed so much in the previous 20 years. I couldn't have imagined belonging to a group of that nature, diverse artists, doing those kind of live storytelling sessions in 1980. In 1980, in fact, I was still illegal in Scotland. So up to 2000, there'd been a huge change, and I wanted to capture this. People who perhaps not just as I had grown up in the 1960s, but had grown up in the 1930s or 1940s. They'd been teenagers in those years. So those were the motivations we started with. And I went round asking questions. First of all, in Scotland, we had our neighbours, very close neighbours really, were Glasgow Women's Library. So we went there and asked, should we do this? Is anybody else doing this? They showed us what they were doing. It wasn't exactly the same. They were doing fabulous things. They were collecting all sorts of materials, but it wasn't oral histories that they were collecting. They weren't collecting recordings of people's stories in their own words. And that's what we particularly were concerned to do. I then went south of the border and went right the way down to Brighton. And they had a wonderful project called the Brighton OurStory project. So they gave us 5 hours of their valuable time, and we looked around their materials. We saw the problems they had. They hadn't got a local archive that was taking their materials, but they had their own archive and their own premises. That sent up flags for me. I thought that was dangerous. And as it happened, it was. Their materials in the end were not preserved. And that's a real tragedy that a lot of that was lost. We did steal one thing from them. We stole their name, OurStory. And that was one of the best things that we took from there. I went to Age Exchange in Blackheath in London and spoke with Pam Schweitzer, who was a pioneer in collecting older people's stories and dramatizing them, putting them into theatre. And that was another thing that we were interested in doing. And finally, and probably, to be honest, most importantly, we went to the British Library Sound Archive and spoke to Rob Perks, the director, absolutely fabulous man, really, really generous with his time. And he's also the secretary of the Oral History Society. And he gave us all sorts of tips on what we should do and was very, very encouraging. So we come back to Scotland and we think, where are we going to start with doing all of this? And well, one of the things that you do, you have to think, we're going to be collecting, we're going to be archiving, we're going to be presenting. I was very interested in the skills that you said you had, and presenting came out top. And I think we thought the same. After all, we were diverse artists. We were used to the idea of presentation. So rather contrary to what you might think, the normal chronology is you start with collecting, then you archive, and then you take it out of the archive and you present it. We did the opposite. We started with presenting. We rather bravely, and it is quite brave really, we started with an exhibition and we said we're going to do an exhibition. We had a wonderful title for it, which was Becoming Visible, which was a rather clear statement that we were here and we were queer and we were proud to be there. And we decided to have that exhibition in October 2002. And that's also when we became established as an organization. So the exhibition, of course, required you, once you'd advertised it, you said you're going to do it, and you've got it set up, and you've got the weeks which have been allocated to it in the premises where you are. You have to find the materials and put it together. So we did, and there were lots of collages and lots of artworks there, and it was a wonderful exhibition. You can still get a taste of that on our old and rather messy website. If you go to exhibitions and have a look at Becoming Visible, you can do a kind of little tour of it. Very old technology, but rather lovely. So after that, we immediately began with another presentation. So we haven't got round to the archiving, we haven't really got round to the collecting yet. And we looked at theatre, because that's always interested me, how you can take these stories, which in many ways, they are already so dramatic, and see if you can put them in a theatrical context. And we'd had other examples of that in Scotland before that. But we worked with 784 Theatre Company Scotland, and we did that immediately following the exhibition, and it took about 1.5 years. And in 2004, we presented a theatre piece called Sex Shunned. Also, if you read it fast, sectioned. And sectioned is what had happened to many people. They'd been sectioned under the Mental Health Act and had been treated as mentally ill. So it was a nice double meaning there. We included extracts from people's stories, and we also had fictional stories. And I have to tell you that the ones that were most impressive were actually the real stories, not the fictional ones. The fictional ones did not live up to the ones which we had actually collected from people in their own words. Those were far more interesting and in many ways more dramatic. Where we go from there, of course, is to think, well, let's go around to different archives in Scotland and see whether we can get some of this material, because we by now beginning to get material. What are we going to do with it? We're going to have it in somebody's attic? Oh, dangerous. It will go. It will definitely disappear if you do that. So we had to see if we could find some support from libraries and museums in Scotland. And I can tell you it was a struggle. It wasn't easy. At that time, we were not flavor of the month. It's much easier now. You have the language of diversity. We were calling ourselves diverse artists, but that language wasn't there so strongly at that time. So there was an awful lot of knocking on people's doors and having them say, not today, thank you. and maybe suggesting another place to go and ask. And we had to develop a rationale for this as well. Why? And this is something that you may, as archivists, have to do. And one thing that interests me, this could be another Menti poll, Dom, if you want to do it, which would be, have you had and are you having any encouragement to do the archiving of LGBTQ+ stories? Or are you getting the cold shoulder that we got at the beginning? I think the atmosphere has changed. I think it's become easier, but there's still maybe some obstacles to this. And I think it's quite interesting to look at. But certainly, I keep talking in 20-year blocks. There's 1980 to 2000 when Scotland had changed so much. But I also think from 2002, when we were formally established, to 2023 now, then in this 20 years, there's been a huge change too, and it is rather easier to get support for doing this. We did need to develop a rationale. We needed to say to people why we were doing this, and the reason was we were not in those archives. We were not in those libraries. We were not in those museums. And if you, as an LGBTQ+ person, went to a museum or library, you wouldn't find yourself represented. You're either completely neglected or you're distorted in some way. Your representation has been distorted. And I've been thinking about this and thinking how you would go into a library, go into a museum and find representations of yourself. And the main representation that you'll find will be scandal. And if you look at our timeline, and timeline is also on our website, we have a timeline that goes back to James VI of Scotland, James I of England. And basically that starts with scandal because he was involved in various scandalous relationships with his male courtiers. So you go back to that, and almost all of the dates after that were scandalous discoveries. And that means they were either gossip about people who were usually wealthy enough to be gossiped about, and so it's stories of the elite. You don't get stories of the non-elite usually. If you're non-elite, you can appear, but you normally appear in criminal records. And we've got fabulous work being done by Jeff Meek at Glasgow University on looking at criminal records to find out about the lives of people, because that's all we've got. We don't have people's stories in their own words, unless in the case of people who might have written diaries of their lives in coded ways, which are then uncoded later on, or letters which are written in a particular way. But again, that's just going to be of the elite. So if that's what's available in archives and museums, think even of your own family history. Where are our queer relatives? Where do they appear? Are they talked about? They may be in our family conversations about gossip and so forth, but otherwise they just disappear. They're not there. Put them in a family tree, they'll be the unmarried uncle perhaps, or the unmarried aunt. They may be married, but you don't know whether they're LGBTQ+ or not. That disappears totally, and all you get is this formal genealogy. You may be asked, if you're working within a local council, for example, you may be asked to help with family history. I would love it if somebody came along and said, can you help me find my queer relatives? Because I don't think you're going to actually find that. It'll be extremely difficult. So one thing I tried to do when constructing my family tree was to put some of these relationships in, and the software I had at the time actually forbade that. If you try and put in partnerships, same-sex partnerships, it changed the gender of one of them. So you couldn't have the same sex. There's software where you can do this, but the software I was using at the time actually was a kind of moralistic software that said, no, this cannot be. So with all that kind of rationale, you also had to think, well, if we're not there and we can't recognize ourselves, is that important? It is important. And it's not just important from an educational point of view. It's important also from a point of view of identifying yourself. Because one of the things that's emerged from the oral histories that we've recorded, one of the most common things that people have said, and even quite youngish people, I mean, from my point of view, youngish people in their 30s, they would say things like, I couldn't believe that I was that way because the images that were available to me in the media or in libraries or in museums or wherever it was, they were so distorted, or they just weren't there. So if that's the case, you cannot have the words, the images to develop an identity or a community. Because the one thing that's very clear is, in order to develop an identity, in order to have the validation of your identity, you have to have the words, the stories to talk about yourself. So stories help us to develop an identity, they help us to develop a community. Without your stories, if I asked you something about who you are, you're going to tell me a story. If you haven't got a plausible story that is validated in some way, then you can't tell me about yourself. So that's how important it is. So if you need a rationale to argue for archiving LGBTQ plus stories, remember all those points, because I think those are the key things that we found were absolutely important. Some of them we discovered more and more as we were doing the collecting. We discovered that this was so important to people. In the end, we did get a positive response from archives, and it was actually from National Museum Scotland. And I still remember, because I was on the phone to the person who ran the Scottish Life Archive, Dorothy Kidd, and Dorothy is very plain-speaking woman, so I simply argued my case, and I thought, I'm going to get the usual fob off. And she said, yes. And I had to do a double take. I said, could you repeat that, please? Because I actually didn't believe what she'd said. And she said, yes, we'll do that. And basically, that's how we started. So they would take our materials. Later, we had the Mitchell Library agree to take all sorts of things that have been donated to us in terms of magazines, pamphlets, diaries, pictures, all sorts of things like that, particularly ones pertaining to that area, to Glasgow. And they took those. And more recently, we found that the most appropriate place for our digital materials, and particularly our audio and video recordings, was National Library of Scotland. So we have what is absolutely vital for you to have, a proper archive to put them in. Without that, it's almost irresponsible to collect people's stories and say, we're collecting your stories, they will be preserved, unless you have somewhere that you are going to preserve them. So having got to the point of being able to do archiving, we then had to get round to the thing which you all say you're less confident about, which is collecting. And we thought of doing collecting in a number of different ways. Audrey, have I got about 5 minutes left or something like that? How much? 10 minutes left. Oh, well, I can tell you a fair bit about our collecting in that case. Collecting is the one which you say you're not so convinced of, or you're not so confident with. Collecting is such fun, though. Actually, out of all three, I would say collecting is the one which really motivates people, is listening to people's stories. It is an absolute privilege to do so. And what we began with was, I suppose, the classic oral history approach. We wanted to record a whole life story in somebody's own words, in as good an audio as we could possibly do. And so we did the classic oral history recording. And what you would do there is, I would say to Audrey, hello, Audrey, can you tell me something about your early life? And Audrey would begin saying where she'd been brought up and something about her family and neighborhood community and schooling and so forth. Ideally, I wouldn't say anything else for the whole of the rest of the interview. I would just listen. I would use what a lot of you are doing here now. You're using facial expressions to give me encouragement to go on speaking, and that's what you would do as well in that context. You as an oral historian would not interrupt. You don't say, wonderful, yes, right, good. You don't do any of that. You give them the encouragement to go on by your facial expressions. If in some cases people don't go on, then you prompt them. And the prompt is not a set of questions you've got. The worst kind of oral history is I've got 10 questions to ask you. This is question 1. This is question 2. That's not really their story in their own words. Their story in their own words is at some point they dry up, perhaps. And at that point you say something which has come from their story, which encourages them to continue. So you have shown that you've been listening too. It's difficult for us. We've all got big egos, and it's difficult for us to think, well, actually, I'm not so important, but actually the interviewer is really not important apart from that, to be a good listener and to encourage the story to come out. Often the interviewee is going to be somebody who doesn't have confidence. The ones who do have confidence actually don't tend to do the best interviews, I can tell you. The ones who come and don't have confidence, who don't think perhaps that their story is worthy, often turn out to be the most interesting. And I have time to tell you about Margaret. Margaret was one of our first interviews, and Margaret was really quite nervous, and Margaret said, well, I don't think I've actually got a very interesting story to tell you. So I did the usual, tell me a bit about your early life, Margaret. She started off, and with almost no prompting later, she went on for an hour and a half and then said, I don't know what more to tell you. And I thought, well, you've done pretty well. You've done an hour and a half. You've told me an absolutely fascinating story. And amongst that, a total vindication of the rationale I spoke to you earlier about the idea that stories are important for ourselves. Because Margaret came out to herself really at the age of 40. She was an army wife. She traveled around with her husband who had been in the army. She'd got 2 children, and she realized there was more to life. There was an aspect of her life that was totally missing. And she realized that she was a lesbian, and she wanted to explore that part of her life and explore that identity. Up to that time, she'd been able to talk confidently about her life. She'd been great at talking to people, telling stories and so forth. She lost all that confidence. She didn't have the words for it. She didn't have the community support for it. She didn't have the stories to tell. And that's why it's so important to share our stories and give people the vocabulary, the kinds of narrative that they can use to describe themselves and to feel part of a supportive community. So that just came from one oral history recording. We've done lots of other kinds of oral histories. That's the classic kind, and it still remains, I would say, the core and possibly the jewel of what we do is individual oral histories. We still do them. We do them with people who, like Margaret, are unknown. Her second name she didn't want known. She will be known forever as Margaret. That's it. We also have done stories with people who are famous. We've done stories with novelists like Val McDermott, with politicians, with trade unionists and so forth, who are used to public speaking. You get a different kind of story there. Sometimes it's a little less personal, though Val McDermott's was very personal and absolutely fascinating. If you look at the other ways that we've done oral history, we've also sometimes been in a context where you can't have an hour and a half in quiet surroundings to hear someone's story. Maybe all you've got is 15 minutes. So you get short, focused interviews, often on a particular theme, maybe in an event, which is particularly around an exhibition, which is on a theme. And then you have a side room where you go away and do those stories. So you've got focused interviews where you do maybe just 15 minutes on that. And those are also wonderful. And we've done group interviews. Our first group interview was with a group who often feel erased by straight society and lesbian and gay society, which is bisexuals. And so we did a group recording of Bi Scotland. That was our first ever group recording, and we've gone on to do many group recordings since then. So those are the kinds of oral history we do. I'm not going to talk to you more about doing oral history because this is not an oral history training session, but we can perhaps come back to one of the things that we were advised by Rob Perks right from the beginning, which is don't do transcriptions of the whole of an oral history recording. Do it in a summary, because it's the spoken word and it's the emotion that comes over in that that's so important. I'm happy to expand on that a bit later. In addition to oral histories, we decided we would try and collect stories in different ways. And in 2005 to 2008, we were supported by the Scottish Arts Council to go throughout Scotland and collect queer stories. So we did. And in doing that, we found that there were other ways that we learned to do stories along the way. One week was our own idea. It was to write episodes, is to get people, because sometimes you're in a context, let's say you're in Glasgow Pride, and it's so noisy, and you can't possibly do an audio recording. So how can you get somebody's story there? Well, you ask them to jot down a few lines, an episode from their life. So you say, why don't you write something, a turning point in your life, perhaps, that you can write about? And people would write those down, and it would be a handwritten episode. And we've got already 170 of them archived in National Museum Scotland, but we've got more in the process of being archived. And in addition to that, we found when we worked in Dundee, Dundee's been very significant for us in all sorts of ways. We got tremendous support from Dundee Contemporary Arts, DCA Dundee. And they had people who were suggesting that we would do visual storytelling. And so again, I can give you more detail if you're interested in that, on the ways that we did visual storytelling, so that we could have images that worked alongside text and which were particularly powerful. And some of those are in a slideshow that Robert, I think, is either going to show later on, has already perhaps shown some of that. So with oral history, with text, with visual storytelling, with drama, there's all sorts of ways in which you collect stories, but you also present them. And the presenting, we come back to that at the end, the presenting is very, very important, because if you just collect the stories and just archive them, you feel you're doing a good job. You feel you're making it safe for the future, but you're not actually giving feedback to people in the here and now. So the presenting is very important. There's an article on this, which actually was written for the in-house magazine of the Scottish Council of Archives. Is it called Broadsheet, Audrey? Is that what it's called? Yes. Broadsheet, and you'll find it's on our website. It's on the research section of our website, which will be one of the links that is shared with you, and it's called Coming In and Out of the Archives, and it shows the importance of this kind of virtuous circle. You collect, you archive, you take it out of the archives, you present it, it comes back in to inspire people to give you more stories, so you get a virtuous circle that goes on there. Coming in was actually one of the themes that we developed along the way, and I'm going to end by just mentioning a couple of those themes, because themes are things which inspire you over the years, which you develop, and actually for us, we never stop doing them. So once we develop a theme, we don't say, right, we finished that one. We have it as a possibility to go on and be reinvented and given further life in a later period. And there's two I'd like to mention. One was in response to people who were saying, but can you actually bridge the gulf with straight people? Can you have stories that will bridge that gulf? And also include lots of different minority ethnic groups, disabled people and so forth within the same framework. And we came up with the project Love Out of Bounds, because everybody has had at some point in their life people who they've fallen in love with, and their community or their family or their friends have said, oh, they're not for you, they're wrong for you, you shouldn't, it's wrong, there's something bad about it. So Love Out of Bounds was something that brought together people from all sorts of different communities and bridged the straight LGBTQ divide. And the other theme that we developed was Coming In, which was developed the day after the Brexit referendum, when we realized there were a lot of people in Scotland who would be feeling suddenly extremely unwelcome. And to be fair, the politicians in Scotland were very good on this. The leaders of all 5 political parties in the Scottish Parliament immediately the next day said, don't worry, you are very welcome here. But we knew that actually many people would feel threatened, and that what we could do to help with that was to celebrate people who had come into Scotland and had found that they could form their identity and community here. And so we developed the Coming In project, which in the end, it's again, something that applies to almost everybody. You move to a different place, you find the expectations that constrained you before perhaps fall away to some extent. You may have new expectations to face, and you find you have a different identity that you can forge in the new environment. We've had many other themes that we've developed over the years, but Dom is going to talk about the more recent ones later on. I think I've had my time allocation there, Audrey, so I shall stop at that point. I think is there room for questions or something like that now?
I was going to say I'm unmuting now. Yes, there is time for questions, and I've been on the chat putting on some links for people, but also asking if anyone wants to ask a question themselves, because we have one from Catherine. I don't know if Catherine wants to ask her own question. I'm trying to see, I've asked if you want to turn your camera on, Catherine. There's quite a lot of people on this. And then you can unmute as well. But if not, I'm not seeing anything from Catherine. I might ask the question myself to you, Jaime, and that is, I'm just seeing where she has asked the question. It is between an artist and myself as we work through a new project. What does it mean to hold stories that can't be told, and how does this relate to the body of the archivist?
Stories that can't be told. In what sense can't they be told? Is this because the person themselves hasn't got the confidence to tell them, or?
I'm not sure.
I read that question and I asked if it was in like in a sense of the body and like vicarious trauma, secondhand shock. And is that what you mean? Is that Carol's on screen?
Hi. Yeah, it's been working through this kind of project, thinking about, there has been times where it's users, people want to share their story, and perhaps there's been an element of that isn't to be shared, or maybe isn't right to be shared. And it's something this artist and myself have been working out, like, how does that affect us as the artist and the archivist doing these projects, and is there an element of care that we need to look at as a group? And it was just something we kind of jotted that down. How does that relate to us while we work through this? Or, you know, obviously things can get sealed and closed for a time period, but it can sit with you for a while and alter that relationship as you go through the project. Of course. So it's just like just kind of in my head when I was listening.
I'm certainly happy to address that, because that has happened on quite a few occasions, Catherine. We've had people who've said, I'm going to share this with you now, but I don't want it. Either I don't want it to be recorded. That's easy because you just don't record it. I do want it to be recorded, but I don't want it to be shared now. And we do put a time limit on things. So we say, for example, I don't know why it happens, but people say 30 years. I don't know why 30 should be such a popular figure, but it is. People will say, I'm happy for this to be known in 30 years' time, but I don't want it to be public now. Some people say I'm happy for it to be known after my death, or in the case of one person who told us about a very famous person and knew the story of their life, they said, I don't want this to be known while their partner is still alive. And so I am now going on to Wikipedia now and then and looking to see if that person is still alive. And I shall leave, when I'm gone, I'll leave this to Dom to look on Wikipedia. But there's that aspect. But there's another way in which that you can approach this, and I'm sure you know of this as well. You will be very aware of this, which is you can tell the story in a slightly different way. You can fictionalize it to some extent. You can do it perhaps through artwork in some way. So you can develop ways in which the story can be told. but which don't necessarily identify the key people, or which distance it sufficiently from the person that the emotion, in a sense, won't overwhelm them. So that is the other way in which you can approach this. But it's a very good story and it comes up all the time. Very good question.
Right.
I want to add to that about the individual, because we do hear things that we're not always prepared for. You don't know where somebody's story is going to go. It can be incredibly triggering for you to be able to sit there. You're intensely focused on this person, and we know how that impacts our bodies and how that makes us feel even on a level that we're not aware of. And these things can come up, but it is just basic. It's the basic stuff. See a therapist, good self-care. I've got a beach. All my neighbours know I go to that beach and you'll see me cry for the things I hear. I'm also a therapist, a trauma therapist. That has really gave me an awareness of what we're asking our volunteers to do by going, and they don't know how this story is going to go. So I'm always available. We always can come together in a confidential setting and share how it was for us, the stuff that we don't get to take part in when we're sitting intensely listening. Sometimes you need to get that out with people that will get it, that'll understand, and that's really good to do that and support each other. Really support each other, makes room for that, makes space for that, because you cannot make contact with another human being and not be changed from it. It will change you. These stories do impact you as a person. And we can't deny that. Just don't even try denying that. Just take on board that you will be impacted. So do what you have to take care of yourself. That's the best you can do. See a therapist, do that, work on a self-care routine that ticks those boxes. It's really, really important.
I would back that entirely, and also say that you shouldn't be surprised if you find that you are brought to tears by some of the stories that you hear, because there are some very, very, very tragic stories out there. And the person themselves telling them stories may be very upset. Sometimes you'll be more upset because they kind of have come to terms with that, but it's the first time you've heard it. We also warn this with some of the recordings we've got are so tragic that basically we warn people who are doing a summary of that recording, take your time with this, don't do it all at once. You're going to find it's very disturbing. So we say, if it's too difficult, we'll pass it on to somebody else, because it can be extremely tough. And even listening to our stories, not having to do anything with it, as a member of, as it were, the general public, you can get very upset. And we kind of usually warn about that, particularly stories of very distressed childhoods. But John will come on to that later, so I won't talk about that now. Are there further questions at this point?
I was going to say there is. I think we've got, maybe I'm going to be the time master here. We've got time for one question. We have other questions, but maybe we could put them at the end when we've got a dedicated 25-minute session. So it's Ash Thompson who's going to ask her own question. Ash?
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Perfect. Hi, thank you, Jaime and Dom. That's been really interesting. And Jaime, when you were talking about having support and encouragement, something that we have at Edinburgh City Archives is a lot of support and encouragement to collect, but we actually just don't know how, because we don't have any relationships or any ins into communities. And I just wondered, is that something that you've come across a lot, that the encouragement is there, but services just don't actually know how to go about it appropriately?
Are you thinking in terms of finding LGBTQ people to record, for example, something like that, and getting contact with people?
I mean, I guess it's a bit of that, but it's also a bit about just making people aware that the archive is for everyone and everybody's stories are important. So it's just to engage with us in any way, really, not necessarily just to collect, just to make them aware of us. And if people want to contribute, absolutely.
I know one of your colleagues, Anna McQuarrie, and she has taken me around your archive and shown me the amazing stuff that you've got from Edinburgh City. And it's right next to Broughton Street, which is a lovely little coincidence as well, which I think is great. And what's really, really interesting as well is like doing exhibitions recently. Like I really want, it was during COVID, so it was difficult to get to you guys, get all your material, but I know it all. I've got loads of photos on my phone and I share it often, and I tell people, go get a tour, get in touch with them, send an email, do that. And I also say there's a total lack of trans objects, trans stories in your archive. It's very LGBT. The B is very well represented, which I think is great. I really enjoyed that. Bisexuals on stage, live bisexuals on stage. There's a great poster, I can see it in my head. But yeah, getting that in contact, I do push people to come and visit you guys, come and say, oh, I've got a relationship to this or that, and get in touch. But I really, really do that. And I push for people to say, show up, bang on the door, tell them I've got stuff, because we get that as well. And I think we're going to talk about an example, Jim Mearns, when as well, just tell you now, he contacted us during lockdown. Many people went to their attics and found lots of stuff. Jim was in that position. He worked with the trade unions in the campaign to end Section 28. He really, really put his heart and soul into this, and he had lots of material. Again, we wanted to get that material to a safe place that it would be housed. It was the library that contacted it. It was great. There was a courier sent on motorbike. It was amazing stuff. Grab these posters, all these, loads of material, and internal magazines campaign and explaining what Section 28 was, why it was important to be against it. And again, it was agreed with the museum that we could get a remote recorder, so it was safe at that time, talking about his experience of, and it was really moving. It was, isn't it? It was incredibly moving. This is one that makes you cry, because you're walking up to the pedestal in this big conference to have your big moment, and it's cancelled, but you got what you wanted, you've won. So at that time, he's just full of these emotions, and this really, I want to say staunch man just breaks down in tears, and you go on that journey with him. My voice is going telling you the story. And that's a good example. So now that material, his story, are now held together in the same place. So we do that. We do liaise between institutions and our community all the time. We will chap on doors. We will do that and say, like, just as James said, if we need a place to have a safe place where something can be housed, we do not have a warehouse, an archive, a loft that's not safe. You need some place that's an institution that will be safe. And that's good to say to people, your story might be listened to in like 300 years time, if that institution is still standing. And I'm sure Edinburgh City will still be standing somehow in that time. Your fingers crossed. So that story will be safe. Yeah. On you go, James.
I was going to say, Ash, there's kind of two sides to this. One is the collecting. You've got the archive, but you're wanting to do further collecting, and you're wanting to do further presenting as well. The presenting will help to bring in the material. So when you do various different kinds of presentation, you have to do it, but you also obviously have to let people know. So the way to do it is to get onto the LGBTQ+ networks and tell people that the exhibition is there, but also to try and work with local groups. The one thing that we've found doesn't tend to work so well is drop-in. You can have a wonderfully organized thing and you say, why don't you drop in and tell your story? Nobody drops in, or just one or two people drop in. It is better to work with pre-existing groups and to say, why don't you come one afternoon and we will show you the materials we've got, and we will actually collect more materials from you at the same time. So you do it all in this kind of wonderful virtuous circle of presenting and collecting so that you can add further to the archive.
That's really helpful, thank you, because something that I've just had pitched to me for a project I'm going to do is drop-ins, and I was skeptical about that. So now I have further validation of that. So that's really helpful.
It's just bitter experience, I'm afraid.
That sounds good. So drop in is becoming drop out, I think is what you're saying to me.
It can be.
So that's sort of last question right now, because we're going to hear from Dom, and we're going to hear about the present OurStory Scotland and maybe the sort of plans you have for the future.
Oh, exciting, isn't it? There's some sort of questions that I should be able to answer on the way. as well. And a bit there, like partnership works, you'll see that all the stuff that we do is partnering up with people. That's totally works for you. That's a big strength in our community, is we work with anybody, and we're everywhere, which always helps. We are everywhere. That always helps. So I'm going to take you back to just before, it's like the land before COVID, really. And I was approached by another charity, Pink Saltire, to do a series of podcasts. And I thought, oh, we could make podcasts of the pre-existing material, and that would be really easy to just make extracts, do themes, and just bam, done. But maybe me, I thought, no, we'll have more material. This will be good because it will be OurStory Scotland. We'll get our stories, our oral history recordings, and Pink Saltire will get their commission podcasts. So we started on 50 years of rainbow activism, and it was for people who were over 50. There was a few 48, 49ers that snuck in, but most of the people were to early 50s, right up to 78, I had a 78-year-olds. And that was just about what was it like? What are the stories of and queer elders? And I'm putting that in inverted commas because not everybody was happy with that. They just wanted to be called old people, and that's totally fine. It's all right to say old. And so I started online social media. We've always used it in our community. I've always been very savvy when it's been getting online and getting contact, reaching out and finding our own. So that was it. Go online. I'm thinking, oh, well, I get many people. I had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of emails from people. Nearly 90%, it was impossible to do. I would have loved to have travelled the country. I could still be doing that. We are still chasing people to get their interviews from that time. But I started on a timetable, so it was 3 weeks, and I'd done, I think it was 24 people in that 3-week period. So it was doing couples and doing groups. And that's always good because humans are naturally curious. They'll have their own follow-up questions. You can just sit back and let this lovely process happen as well. And we got some great interviews. There's, I'll get links for you. Another one that we done was I'll jump back a bit because that was when COVID hit. So that was a time and that we had to think about, right, we had to care for each other and our community. So if I'm traveling around the country meeting people who can be vulnerable, most of us have a disability in some way, shape or form. There was a time that I had to cut early. I stopped a week before we kind of locked down, a couple of weeks before the big government lockdown to keep our community safe. And we automatically started looking at ways that we could bank people for possibly the future. And then it soon became that we had to look at ways that we could safely continue our work under lockdown conditions. A lot of people had just shut shop. Many people had done that, but we kind of felt, no, this is really, really important. We really need to start getting our stories because we'd never get our stories recorded. This is an opportunity to have the queer COVID story. So we did put in queer distance. You can tell us about your day under COVID. You can write a daily routine, a diary, give us an episode. What would life like keeping a distance from your community? And as well, what was it like to hear things like chap on your neighbour's doors and ask for help, possibly outing yourself, putting yourself in a vulnerable position is very cis-het white advice that never worked for 90% of our community. I live in Fife, so it's quite a broad area, and we're not centralised. We're spread out. My queer neighbour is quite far away. I don't know if they're even in Fife, maybe just on the boundary of Fife. So that advice doesn't really work for our community. So it was collecting those stories, getting that in a safe way. We also looked at some software to do remote recordings and looked at the advice from the Oral History Society. And they said keep them short and themed. So we did that. That's what we started doing. We started looking at this queer distance, or if anybody came to us with, I want to talk about my masculinity, I want to talk about my parents, I want to talk about work, I want to talk about coming in. A lot of the themes that we'd already come up with, they worked already for this remote recording. And so far, when you get the hardware right, earpieces and a good microphone, it's very good. It works excellent. And with some people, if people are, it doesn't really matter on age or any demographic. If people are just comfortable being online, you can sometimes get that real connection and get a real full oral history recording from someone. It's not always, that's in my experience, anecdotal. With a good software, we use Squadcast, good quality mic, you can get really, really good audio recordings remotely. So when it comes to times where people are safe or they're far away, miles mean nothing. You can still collect those stories. That's really changed everything, and we're keeping that up even after all lockdowns and stuff are gone. COVID is still very much here, but even without that, we would definitely keep up the ability to do remote recordings. Is very, very, very useful. Another one that we were asked by the Children's Parliament to also commission a series of podcasts, and it was lovely to have all our volunteers jump on board. Like, this is lovely, like we're going to tell these lovely stories of children and play and giggling, and no, that is not what we found. Our childhoods are tough, and it ended up being really quite, getting extracts, putting podcasts together, voiceovers, easy, but going round and round these extracts, it became tough. And even the last one, it's Derek Ogg. Derek Ogg was a QC or a KC now. He's passed away now, an amazing HIV activist and a very handsome man. I always say that, he was very, very handsome. His end to one of the episodes still stays with me, and I always think about that. He had a choice when he was young to change things for the future and make the world the one that he imagined, and he done so much. And that's incredible to come out of someone's childhood when you know this man's future, you know this story. It's incredible, very, very, very incredible. And again, you're used to presenting. That's another way to present these stories, to say, well, what do you do? Well, listen to this. You can send someone a link. Also, for different audiences, kids love to be in the archive, in the library and museum. They think that's amazing. They don't care about podcasts because they can just whip one up in an afternoon. But older people, they seem to really enjoy the idea of being in a podcast because that's what kids listen to. That's maybe a generalization, but a lot of people were really excited that they were going to be in a podcast when I'd done the 50+ series. And again, like James said, it's very interesting to be in that position to hold these people through their stories. Many who'd never revisited places that they did with me can be quite emotional. I was invited to lunch and got fed by people. It's excellent. Go and do it. If you have the funds, you get the ability to travel and meet people to do that. Definitely pursue it. Definitely pursue it. During COVID and lockdown, we were asked to do a lot of varied kind of training. We done HR professionals for local authorities. It was there for their well-being. And we were asked, there was 600 people there, and we were asked to present some of the stories. So we looked at, again, it was like schooling and employment and like even retirement and death, because these were the HR professionals who thought, what are people dealing with? We were told to keep it happy, which we couldn't do. We were like, okay, we will not do that, but thank you. So we put it together. And we were all quite shocked. We had a lot of stories coming back. People were very, very surprised, and we were equally surprised that there seemed to be this disconnect between HR professionals and our stories, our narratives, our experiences, and their context and their setting. Also, I done a lot of training with Fife psychiatric community nurses. They wanted to do, because of the atmosphere, they wanted to do trans awareness training. We were able to put together a very good package and work with, I think I've done 29 nurses 3 times over a couple of months. And that was very, very interesting to hear them be able to relate very easily to with patients' stories and just more worried about getting things right and wanting to be able to do their jobs to their best of their abilities. And it was lovely to be able to connect them to the stories that they were a bit not so confident and traversing and navigating. But again, it shows the power of what you can do with oral histories, how versatile. Jaime was right to call it the jewel in the crown. You have an infinite resource that you can come back to, infinite. And that's something else. Like the BI+ Scotland interview, I met up with them 14 years after the original interview, and that was really, really interesting to do the same thing. And oral history is very, very similar. So tell me about yourself, and just let them go. And it was harrowing to hear that in 14 years, not much had changed. Nothing had changed. It was the same things, the same prejudice from the same people, time and time again. And everybody was just a bit more bored with it after 14 years. That was the only thing that had really changed. We'll jump now to, as the world is opening up a bit, and kind of what we're doing now, keeping an eye on time, good. And we're doing a lot with, I want to give it, like Jaime talked about having to knock on doors. Hello, please, will you take our stories? And I've got an image here, like it's almost like Dickensian at this big door and this big tall thing answers and just like looks down on you. And I have to say, things have dramatically changed. We have this, everyone wants to queer their archives, and then everyone's like, help us queer the archives, because we don't know what that means. And it's interesting because a good example is the V&A in Dundee and how they've went about this. And they are lucky, they're new, so they do not have hundreds of years of institutional bias and all this stuff. Like, we can argue that there's some colonial stuff, we can argue that there's definitely dynamics at play, but within the institution itself, they're not up against this big monolith, which has really, really, really given them the opportunity to say, right, if we're going to do this, let's do it right. And I think, so far, I think they have. They've got themselves an LGBT working group of staff there. It's interesting because the head curator, admittedly, Meredith will say herself, she's a cis het woman, and then she just like loves it. And I don't know how to characterize her, but she does her work very well because she is a leader and she listens to the assistant curators, the archivists below, who are all in the community, and they have made a lot of time to listen to their concerns, a lot of space for make room for them. Because as we know, when we make contact with something and it feels queer, that's a lot of subjective data that's within us, that's hard to get out and sometimes takes an whole oral history for other people to get their heads around. And they've taken that time, they've given that room, approached us, approached many others, wanting the full point of view from not just one person, but the communities within our community. And that, I think, is very important. This has come to a head over there, that we've done a good whole day event with them. And there's another way to tell stories. We ask people to bring in an object. I'm going to use my cup. Bring in an object. It's about you. It expresses your LGBT, your identity, something about you. So everyone brought in. None of them were similar. They were all very unique, all very personal. Very rare that you would get them archived because they are so personal. It would need to be an archive like ours. But it was a way for these people to hold themselves, hold the story in this object. The focus was on the object, and there was some really, really poignant stories told. And either Jaime, your ring was focused. That was in an article about wearing a ring, a certain type of ring on a certain finger was a way to communicate your queerness to others, but not everyone could read that. There was a lot about coded, the queer word for it, flagging. There was a lot about flagging and how that has changed. There was a woman who brought in a lovely necklace that had the 2 signs for women on a necklace, and for her, that was a really powerful thing from her youth, I'll call it, in Australia, and how now that can be read differently, and she's horrified that people might believe that she could be transphobic because of this powerful symbol for her youth that she's still got such a real strong relationship with. And it was lovely to see that. And also the mix, there's someone brought in, I'm getting excited now, I'm sorry. It was a Batman eyeshadow palette. So it was a lovely, unique way for this person who was involved in drag and exploring their gender through makeup to have such a masculine Batman case. I know the palette was all named right after the Joker and the characters, and I just thought this was amazing, this lovely queerness in this object. The work has kind of let their team and ourselves look at the queer connections in their collection, and they've put together the lavender labels. So you can visit the V&A, and we've contributed to looking at places. My favourite is the public toilets. Yeah, my favourite is definitely the public toilets. And I think Jeff Meek has really went to town on that one as well, and getting the language perfect. Absolutely beautiful for the time. I'm of the opinion sometimes, I could argue with Jeff, that we're talking to a contemporary audience. They want language that they understand gay, they understand queer. They understand that, and it doesn't take much to explain that. Ask someone like the V&A has done to put that together and use that language. We're going to again be doing more James talking on a wonderful panel on queer spaces, because that's another way to get people's stories a space. And we always think when you walk through, especially a city centre, but don't underestimate the countryside and a lot of our lovely mountains and hills in Scotland, when you can say, tell me your queer relationship with this place. And it might have a mainstream history, a mainstream identity, but there's often a queerness to the places around us. Theatres, the public toilets is a good example. That is a place of rebellion and resistance and oppression, but also like of celebration and sex and all these wonderful things. There's a whole history that I could talk for another 2 hours about that in itself. It's amazing to be able to use that space. After that, we're having a Queer in the Map of Dundee event, and we've done this in Edinburgh, Glasgow, Fife, and now Dundee. And Ayr, yeah, I knew there was one that was missing. I knew that. Thank you. And Ayr, where we asked the community to come and give us their stories, put it on a map of this area, write it down, stick it. If it's a cruising area, if it's a place that you find scary, if it's the bus stop that you met your pals and kissed a boy, whatever, these places, these stories, this undercurrent that's all around us, these lovely queer stories, giving people the opportunity to talk about a place is a lovely way. It's like an object for them to start expressing, and it's a lovely way for us to collect that undercurrent. There's a lovely one that was done, and there's a 2014 that Donald and others done, the Glasgow queer like walk in Glasgow, the Glasgow the Women's Library also too. It's based on ours, and it's very much the same text that theirs is on their website. And again, it's like using in theatres, like where Edwin Morgan met his lover. That's people are going to the theatre. That's not what they're going there for, but that's what we went there for, and that's a really important aspect to collect and be celebrated. Really, what time are we on? Oh, I'm a minute early. Am I right? Well, I can't hear you, Audrey.
Sorry, hang on. You're a little bit over actually.
That's not like me.
That's okay. That's absolutely fine. I was engrossed in what you were saying. So what I've been sort of feverishly.
I'll explain
yes,
them.
please
We'll
do.
have a little break, but if I share my screen again and present from here. I need to take a little pictures. Can you see this? So this is what we want. We're going to have a break, but during that break, I want you to think about this. Get a pen and a bit of paper together. If you want, you can use your phone or whatever. And this is a theme that we have kind of used a couple of times for online sessions to tell stories, because we've found that everyone is a transgression. Everyone's a transgressor. We all are faced with rules that we didn't make up, that society just gives us. and we find ourselves in a position that we have to be a transgressor. Often at the start, I give the definition of this, and at the end, people want to change the definition. It's very, very different. So we find that there's not anybody in their life who has not transgressed the gender norms that are given to them in their society. Nobody.
I can't see that screen.
Can you not see the screen? Can you see it?
I
Audrey?
can. Anyone else can't see it?
But it's
Hands
just a
up?
blank slide that's showing. So
Is
Yeah,
it?
I've just got blank slide.
Oh, sorry, it's a blank slide, but it gives
I'll
us the
start again.
Mentimeter code.
Right, go to the Mentimeter codes. It should have transgressions
Right.
written on it.
Yes.
That's us.
Right, good.
Yeah, that's
Perfect.
it. That's it.
So I want you to think about a time in your life when you have transgressed the gender norms imposed upon you by society. Have a little think and scribble down 2 to 5 lines about this memory, about this experience. We would see this would be a short episode from your life, and we collect these in written form, as James said, and they're excellent. They're excellent. They're lovely to also get handwriting and spelling mistakes. I've got this lovely tangible paper, and that I know that's Audrey's thing. We were talking about that yesterday, Audrey, about conserving paper. So I was thinking about our written episodes. You made me think about that. Interesting. So we're going to have a little 5-minute break. And we'll
Come back here just before 5 to everyone. Yeah, Dom, can I hand over to you?
I will put that back up if everyone's back. Right. So if I share my screen again, hopefully you can see it. Ta-da! Can you see that all? Is it good? Right, excellent. So we have different ways of collecting, like James said, and we've done episodes right from the start. This is a great way of asking people to give us a wee punchy thing as well. It's really a nice way to interpret our stories. I would like you now to look at your 2 to 5 lines, and take out a word or a sentence that encapsulates that for you. If you can't do that, you can try and summarize down your whole thing into one sentence. If you can do that, that's up to you. I would totally up to you. I'm not going to say I prefer any. I nearly did. I'm not going to. I'm going to leave that totally up to you and get you to add it to the screen. You should be able to put in a comment and they should appear hopefully on screen. And in a way, well, not in a way, this is going to be a record of this event. We're going to co-author a sort of poem of the transgressions of everyone at this event towards the norms, there's the gender norms that society has given them, what we can inherit. So if they start to show up, would be nice. Oh. I didn't want to ruin my new bag. Discouraged to learn. Oh, I could feel that one. Married someone of the same sex. Lovely, minor, but important to me. Yes, yes, thank you. See that? Do you not think that could be a theme in itself for many of our stories? Being butch. Didn't have to shave my legs or underarms. Oh, stop, and again, 2 of them, lovely. Stop shaving my legs and under my arms. Fabulous earrings. Loving football. Called a tomboy. I love that. And we have many, like, James, you would like that word. You would refer to yourself as a tomboy.
That's the problem. I felt I was a tomboy, but that was a term that reserved for girls. So it's very ironic.
Growing facial hair, so powerful. I think our physicality, how people read us, our contact with the world is so important. Our ability to have control over our bodies is so, so important to our community. So important.
The hair thing is interesting. At Edinburgh University, we had a session on I think it was on moving bodies or something like that, and it was very significant. A lot of people talked about the norms around hair. It's so significant to people. It's quite amazing.
I used to have quite long hair until recently, and I just took it right off the clippers, and it's incredible how people's interaction with me has changed because of that. very, very strange. I was not expecting that. I think misgendered at birth, I think that ownership of these things, like having a childhood, having families, having these things that people take for granted that can be quite stinging on like Christmas adverts. Those things, those again, minor but important to me. These things can be really, really important.
I'm fascinated getting caught kissing a boy at primary school. We had somebody who told exactly that same story. In fact, it was it's episode number 1. It was episode number 1. We collected it in Glasgow. Somebody had that same story, and how that led to all sorts of rejections from that point on. And I also like the one about the expectations of hypermasculinity. It's not just non-LGBTQ plus people who, the straight world, which will have expectations of us. We get expectations within our world as well, and we get rejected sometimes within our own communities.
There's one I just can't see. Gay men too often want the other. Is it going to move? Oh, here we go. To be this hyper masculinized fantasy.
Yeah, that's the one I was referring to. Yeah,
I couldn't see that one.
yeah.
Clothes inappropriate. Yes. Just this idea of having to be presentable at work, and how that means nothing and can be quite like, I don't know if that's the context that you're thinking of, I don't think so, but that can be often what we hear, just that unnecessary conflict. Crossed legs.
I love that one. I absolutely
Yes.
love that one.
Crossed legs.
That sums up so much.
Yes, I think there's a lovely like gender queer place for legs and what we do with them. I like that as well. This is excellent. But again, oh, femme shoes from Gas Women's Section and TK Maxx. Oh, excellent. You can get decent sized women's shoes in TK Maxx. I've been told this so many times, by the way. TK Maxx is the way to go. That's amazing. But do you see how these are lovely, lovely, punchy encapsulations of big, big stories? And then putting these together like this, we have been able to co-author a lovely, lovely poem, a lovely construction of some sorts. And it's just so, oh, yes. I can't explain more than what I can see on screen. Lovely. Thank you, everybody, for participating in that and sharing these lovely stories. Again, like James said, it's such a privilege to be told someone's story. Even wee short things like this, such a privilege.
And it's also reaffirming to everybody, because they see so many other people with the same discoveries about themselves or the same experiences. It's very, very reaffirming for people, and it crosses boundaries, crosses all sorts of boundaries.
And it's that reciprocal nature that when you tell a story, people suddenly realize that their own story is worthy of telling. It's the same, there is that narrative, there's that connection, there's these lovely overlaps, these themes. Gorgeous, absolutely gorgeous. And it's something that we find in it doesn't matter the identity of the person that's talking, all of our interviews, people do talk about gender, talk about these things that they inherit and they don't understand, these rules that they have to somehow navigate. Some of us do really well at it, some of us find it absolutely impossible. So that's, again, reaffirming that, again, everybody can be found in this position. Lovely. Excellent. Will we move on to the Q&A now, Audrey?
Yes, we can do actually. Yeah, sorry, I think I've put all the links that I wanted to put in to the chat that relate to your earlier conversation, Dom, about the V&A and the lavender labels and the podcast and everything. So the chat will be available for everyone to read later on. So don't worry if you don't get it right now. One of the events that maybe has been put up, and I think it was Jonah that mentioned it. Perhaps that has been sold out, has it?
The event on the 15th will be streamed online, but I do know that the Queering the Map workshop that I'm doing, that starts at 2. I will tell them to open the doors. If someone wants to come and tell their story, I will get the doors open. Like, I even know that there's like, I was in the gunnels at the museum. I know all the escape routes. So I'll get you in. Jonah, if it's Jonah, yeah, I'll get you in, Jonah. Don't worry. I'll get you in.
Okay. So the best thing is I'm going to try and just go back to the beginning of the chat to ask the questions that first came up. So, and I don't want to miss anyone out. And Erin, you have put a question in, and I don't know if you want to put your camera on and unmute. You can ask the question yourself. I'm just looking for you, Erin.
Is that me? Hi, I'm here with my colleague Alistair as well. And I think one of my questions was just a general shout out to say it would be great to hear more about your work in Dundee, but we're both coming to the events at the V&A next week too, so we'll see you there. And I was interested in hearing more from Jaime about, or yourself or anyone else with thoughts on this, about the queer family history and kind of what resources are available, if there's anything you'd recommend kind of reading or good practice on that side of things, because I work for a library where we do get a lot of family history inquiries, and it has come up where people have kind of either known they have a queer relative and wanted to find out more, or have kind of come across stuff in their research that makes them rethink who their relatives were. So
I can address both of those if you like. The first is about how we've worked with Dundee. Dundee was one of the key centres that we went to when we did Queer Stories from 2005 to 2008 in particular. We had centres in Dumfries and Glasgow and Dundee and Aberdeen and Inverness. And in Dundee, what was particularly notable was the support from DCA Dundee Contemporary Arts. In a way, it mirrors the support we're now getting from V&A Dundee. So Dundee's institutions have been extremely supportive of us. And what we found there was that we were able to develop a really wide range of visual storytelling, which we had not been attuned with before. In fact, it hadn't been part of our proposal. And so I had to go back to the Scottish Arts Council, as they were called at the time, and say to them, look, we've got this big opportunity. We've got the opportunity of doing visual storytelling too. And we can also maybe have an exhibition following from this. And they were very flexible. I have heard stories that they're not always flexible, but whoever it was a chance or it was a project that they were excited by. They were very flexible in this, and they said, yes, okay, you can use the money to do those kind of workshops, to have people come and develop our art skills, because we were not skilled people. We were people who, it was like being back at primary school. And I must say, I had a happy childhood up until about the age of 11. So I went to primary school and had a really nice time learning how to do art and so forth. It was one of those primary schools where you could do that. And it was like going back to that. And it was lovely. We had also the ability of people to tell stories about Dundee. And there, it's the only place that I've had somebody contribute about cottaging who was actually a woman, and she said she was a bus driver, and she had done cottaging in the Dundee area. We also had a contribution from Bob Kant, who was pioneering in writing a book about people's stories back in the 1990s, and he told us about the importance of Dundee in terms of a centre for places outside Dundee, and where you could find the queer bars and the places where you could meet people. They were all very near the bus station because you had to get the last bus back home. So that's the kind of material that we got. So we got lots of stuff from Dundee. You were going to say?
Sorry, would you mind putting the name of that author in the chat so I can look up the book?
Well, I could say I'm not good with doing chat, so I'm going to just tell you it. It's Bob Kant, and it's Kant spelled like Kant, C-A-N-T. And his pioneering book, which he's now got, the second edition has come out, is Footsteps and Witnesses, which again is an absolutely wonderful title, brilliant title. That was the first thing that you mentioned. What was the second thing? Can you remind me of the second thing?
It was about family history, kind of research and practice.
Well, official family history in terms of family trees, it's very difficult to do anything with. You have to kind of fight in a way. You fight the software a bit to include people, but you can usually write notes on people, and you can use images and you can attach it to things. And I think if you go onto something like, for example, Wikitree, which allows you, it's a free project, which allows you to add things to it, I think you can add plenty of notes there, as long as you recognize there are ethical aspects to this. We'll perhaps come on to ethical things later on, but you can certainly do that. I had a particular relative who I knew had been gender transgressive, which was my great aunt Edith. She was an extraordinary woman, and she was seen as very masculine by my relatives, and they all rather looked down on her. They were rather conservative in a double sense, both politically conservative and conservative in terms of gender norms. And so they looked down on her because she was a radical. She identified as a Maoist Quaker, which is an interesting combination. And she was seen as quite masculine in style. When the Queen came to her hometown, she drew the curtains in protest and wouldn't look out. So for me, she was a kind of hero. But how do you celebrate somebody like that when you don't know? What do you do? And I wanted, in a sense, to queer Aunt Edith without having to necessarily distort her life or say that she had a label that she didn't have. It is a dilemma. And one thing I did was I took something which I'd learned at DCA Dundee, which was to do Andy Warhol type screen prints. And I took the only picture I could find of Great Aunt Edith, and I put it into an Andy Warhol type 4 screen prints with different colors, and then wrote my story of relating to her. And in a way, then it becomes a way in which you incorporate her, you queer her without doing a distortion to her life. And with other papers which I had about her, I got that archived in a feminist library. So that's one way you can do, but you have to work with the people and their memories.
It's similar with, like, my family. My mum, I think, only once used the word bisexual with herself, but she had girlfriends. So even I have to tell that story. It's part of my story to be telling primary school teachers that, oh, mum and her girlfriends went away and dad was looking after us. Like in the 90s, that was like shock horror, and that whole aspect of that. So there's a lot of like kind of child protection stuff that you might get weighed into as well. If you're coming to the Dundee event, I'll introduce you to someone who's got a very queer family. And I don't know, like, define queer family. Do you mean like a logical family or a family that has queer people in it? Or both?
I think both, I suppose. I mean, the thing that would come up most at work is maybe somebody's doing traditional family history and either realizes that they have queer relatives to build into that, or they're specifically, you know, trying to find out more about this side of their own history. So yeah, that's the angle that comes up for us most, but I'm also generally really interested in how family history can be a lot wider than what we tend to think of it as, like these boxes with lines in between them and people's experience of the world.
It's a very good point. One of the stories that we actually had in Dundee, is you've reminded me of this now. One of the stories that we had was somebody saying, I came out to my family and my brothers, is 3 brothers, and the other 2 brothers subsequently came out too. So it's 3 gay brothers.
Brilliant. Thank you very much both for those answers. That's really, really helpful.
Okay, thank you, Erin. Actually, that's great. Bethany has sort of made a few comments in the chat, and I wondered if Bethany wanted to unmute and put your camera on, and then you can continue asking yourself, or I can read it out for you. I don't know how you feel. I can see you, Bethany. Oh, you're coming on. It'd be much better to hear from you.
Hello, sorry, my internet connection's awful, so I'm not able to put my camera on. But I was just, my question really was about, so I'm quite early career. I'm currently working in like casual roles, so I'm not like officially part of my institutions, which limits my ability to kind of influence or you know, I get my work packages and I do my work packages, but I still really want to do some of this sort of work, particularly around like queer nightlife and like kind of women and trans inclusive nightlife. How do you get started on this sort of stuff if you haven't got, you know, you're either doing it as a freelancer or you're doing it completely independently?
Well, that was our problem right from the beginning. We had to get that credibility, and we had to work together to do it. It comes, don't worry. You will find other people, basically. Find other people who want to do the same thing. Come together, work with them. Ask yourself that question we asked at the beginning. Who's recording these stories, or who's recording these particular type of stories? If you can't find anybody else who's doing it, do it yourself, but get other people to help you. Form a volunteer band. You don't have to be official, but you will find some, nowadays, I'm sure, you will find some sympathetic officials who will be working within archives, who will be interested in what you're doing. But you have to start probably as volunteers. And I have such respect for volunteers in a way that sometimes official institutions don't. And I'm not going to out various institutions, but we have had some institutions work with us in the past who've taken us completely for granted while they have comfortable jobs and salaries, and we are volunteers and we just give of our time. So I have tremendous respect for volunteers. I think do put your time in, do it, and do it as a project of joy, or what they call a passion project, because that's what it is.
That's what I was thinking. Orla Egan from the Cork LGBT archive, she says this is a passion project. It can be hard to get the balance right. You can put too much of yourself into it because it is your thing. You're very excited. You feel that you're doing important work for your community, capturing voices, everything we've said today. But remember, you pace yourself. It will come. That's a hard balance to get. Believe me, I've burnt out many times doing this. Chasing people, not getting the story, going through that grieving process almost that you've lost that opportunity. But like James said, it does just take reaching out, finding that one person who is like, oh, that's actually, and as well, like we're a charity, people come for volunteers. If a volunteer says, I'm really interested in nightlife, or the trans inclusive women's nightlife in Scotland, then give me a price. How much do you need to go and we'll support you to do that. That's what we do. We've just been explaining that today. So you can come, and we get a lot of our ideas of themes and projects from our volunteers who are part of the community, who have interests, who have unique points of view. I'm not going to name any that have been talked about because you'll steal them, but there are lots kind of ticking around in my head of interests and wee things that people mention. That's like, that's really unique. And that's where you get the passion. That's where people get to follow that. And if they need a recorder, some expenses and some contacts, that's what we do. That's what we're about. Do you know what I mean? What you've just explained is like, you don't have those institutional contacts, but we do. How can we help? Send us an email. There's my emails in the chat just now.
Definitely, that's amazing. Thank you so much. And I really appreciate what you said about volunteers. As a museum volunteer myself, like I really appreciate that. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you for asking such a great question. So Callum Walker also put something in the chat. Callum, are you wanting to turn your camera on if you want, or do you want to as well unmute, or I can ask the question for you? Oh, I'm not seeing him. I don't know if he's...
I can see that in the chat.
Oh, yes. Well, he has asked a question. I can just read it out quickly. One of the difficulties we're facing as an archive embedded within local government is the LGBTQ+ communities. Well-founded hostility to government, particularly when working on politically charged topics such as Section 28. This hostility also continues to work the other way, from government to the community. How would you recommend bringing this divide and overcoming this lack of trust? Our archive is very diverse, but we're unfortunately all tarred with the same brush of local government. Hope I've said that right.
I would
Callum?
probably, my first thought is start by getting the archive to do something for the community. So don't start with the community and think it's their problem for not having lack of trust. do something for the community to begin with. I'm sure you are trying to, Callum, I'm absolutely sure you are, but your colleagues might not be so much. So if somehow you can say, this is something we need to do, we need to work with this community in order to encourage them and give them confidence in sharing stories. We can start with an exhibition or something like that, where you get people to come along, and then perhaps their stories will be forthcoming. So I think you have to start from the local authority. It's understandable why, particularly in, this sounds awful, but I would say particularly in England, which was rather longer to get rid of Section 28 and so forth, and in some parts of the country, it can be more difficult to persuade people that their local authorities can be supportive for them. So you have to demonstrate that to begin with.
I love the power of things like staff networks, LGBT staff networks.
Yes.
You kind of told a story on your question. You kind of told a story of hostility that didn't come out of nowhere. There's history behind that. Tell that story, and people will reciprocate. Invite them to tell. If you have a relationship with this, if you were part of this, if you feel that you want to shout and swear at the local government, this is your opportunity to come and do it. If that aggression, if that animosity is there, record it. That's what you want. That's not something you can gloss over and say, look, we're all friends now, because that's not the truth. That's what you've just said in your question. So I have to say, tell that story. I think when people are part of the community, they are queer people, but they are also civil servants, or they work in local communities, local authorities. Ask them their stories. Tell your story. If you're part of the community, can you tell your story and why? What it's like for you to be a queer person in this place that you have hostility towards, because it's been pretty hostile to you over the years. And that's part of the story. That's part of it. If you tell that, you'll get that reciprocal nature. You're giving that worth to that feeling, that narrative, that gives permission for other people to do the same.
I think one of the stories that we got in I think you were there, Dom, at the same time. This was Lisa, who talked about the danger of being the only out LGBTQ person at work. It can be extremely isolating. So the problem is, if you are the one who's always the go-to person for that, it's almost as if they'll assume straightness in the room, and then they'll turn over to you and they say, oh yes, and there's you, there's the queer in the room. And it can feel extremely isolating. And she found that all aspects of diversity were being put upon her as the person responsible for this, which meant nobody else had to do anything. That is important, not to let that happen. You have to find some sympathetic colleagues who will take this on with you, even if they're not themselves LGBTQ. Otherwise, it can be very isolating.
Yeah, and remember what you're bringing with you. Like, I can't deny my whiteness. I have to be aware of my whiteness when I'm walking around. If I'm interviewing people who are not white, what are they reading when they look at me? When I say, give me your story. So I need to do a lot of work before that person's going to trust me. Do you know what I mean? And that's not, I don't think that's manipulative. I totally get that. That's not something that I would feel totally confident with, because my whiteness is a pattern, and I do not have control how that's read by others. That could be read with such hostility. And I'm just going to stick a recorder and ask you questions, and that might be just like what the Home Office did to you. That could be just like what's going on in your life. And then that brings us on to the ethical side of that as well. Like, is it ethical for you to be collecting these stories as this sign of oppression and hostility? There's a lot going on there for me. I'm really a bit like, I'm thinking a lot. Sitting in a hard position. Don't envy you, basically.
I think there's a question actually, sort of relates in some ways a little bit to that, Martin Astle has asked it. I don't know if he wants to ask his own question. I'm just having a quick look. Oh yes, he does actually. It might not. I was just thinking it might relate, Martin, but please ask your question.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a fabulous session. It's been really interesting and really useful, particularly for somebody like me who's kind of outside the community but wants to learn more. But I was thinking about I've done a lot of work with oral history over the years, and done kind of life story interviews. My question really was about how do you have any thoughts about how you can kind of capture people's queer experience if the focus of your project or your interviews or whatever is something else? You know, how do there may be, I'm just thinking about interviews that I've done. It's not a question that I would have asked. If I was doing a life story interview, I might ask people about courting, as we used to call it. But that in my mind, that's always about kind of, how did you end up, how did you meet the person that you end up getting married to, in that very, in the heterosexual way. So, just questions about if you're, it's different if you have a project which is we're collecting stories of the LGBTQ plus community, but if your project is something completely different, is there a way that you can capture people's queer experience?
I'm thinking that actually one way to do that is precisely to use the kind of themes that we've been talking about so far, because they may elicit the stories that will allow people to feel free they can talk about that. It is difficult because if you're not talking directly about that, and if you don't identify as LGBTQ plus yourself, then the person won't feel they're talking to somebody of the member of the community. It can be difficult, but if it's clear that you're somebody who is listening and not judgmental and so forth, and clearly that would be the case, then what you could do is actually ask them some of the questions on the themes that we've been talking about. So love out of bounds is an obvious one. You could ask them, have you ever during your life had a love that you feel has been rejected by people around you because it's been seen as inappropriate, immoral in some way, or just not the sort of thing you should be doing? You can also ask them about the transgression thing that we did today. Everybody has had that idea of gender norms being applied to them in a way which is over strict, whatever their gender or sexuality. So talk about transgressions a little, and you might just elicit something, and from there you can take you have to listen obviously to what they're saying and take the tune from them. And if the tune comes back in the way that you think, you can develop a little more and give them the ability to do that, the space to do that.
I think because of the language that you used about like kind of heteronormative idea, your head's already thinking, you're already there. Does that make sense? Just ask it. Just be brave enough to say. And I think that's interesting that you said I'm from outside the community. So you're almost being invited, asking to be invited in a bit. And that's okay to just say that, to be immediate and kind of say that. I would like, this is an opportunity you to tell me, even make it more vague. When was the first time that you felt different from people around you? You can slip that in any focused interview, in any theme, and give them an opportunity. You don't know where that's going to go. That's really vague. That could be very, that could be supporting the wrong football team. It could be about gender or sexuality or falling in love, like what James said.
That is a nice one. It's a lovely one. It's a very good example of the kind of question that can elicit interesting replies. If you say to people, have you ever felt different?
Where did you find people like you? How did you find people like yourself?
And you don't need to then put the label upon them. They can come back with a label if they want to.
Yeah, thanks. That's really useful. And I was thinking really about being kind of allowing a space for somebody to tell me that that they have these experiences without me knowing it in the first place. So somebody can tell me their experience of being growing up as a gay teenager without me knowing that they were gay. Do you know what I mean?
Yes, absolutely that. So you have to ask those questions which will allow them to do that if they feel comfortable to do so. You can never force it, but you can give them that space.
But I've got this also, that tell me if I'm wrong, let's imagine that you're waiting for someone to come out to you, and that's a dynamic that we experience, like, oh, give me that, come out to me. And I don't know if that's something that you've experienced. You've had to come out in a way that you need to be challenging to those around you. But that can be a very, very dangerous thing to do, and you don't know the ramifications that have happened from coming out in the past. Or that person might have came out 57 times that day and then met you for an interview. And that can be really challenging and a dynamic that you might not always be aware of. It might not be as present for you as someone who's from outside the community. But that using that language and being aware of that, I am from outside the community. So I'd invite you to tell me, as if like you kind of use the way a tourist and you're looking for a guide, use that dynamic. You're not the power dynamic is no longer, you do not have it anymore. It's this person who has all the power, and you have to admit that. It's part of the dynamic that goes on between us. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
That's great. There was a question really early on in the chat from Veronique, and I would just like to ask her to unmute and put your camera on if you like, and ask Dom or Jane the question.
Hi, yeah, thank you. Can you hear me? I can't put my camera on because my internet's being a bit difficult this morning, or this afternoon rather.
Yeah, we can hear you. Yeah, loud and clear.
All right, brilliant. Thank you for your points so far. I think my question was more about, so first of all, my name is Veronique, and I am a museum worker based in London, and I work at the Museum of the Home, which is in Hoxton in London. And I do like collections management stuff. But I'm interested in this question of like co-ownership and like models for co-ownership, specifically around like collections and like how we, because I think what it is often is like conversations around how things are made accessible always comes like slightly after the collecting. And I'm wondering how you have spoken about like access specifically around the ownership of the thing that's being collected, right? An example for on my side of things has been that, you know, we've had like an oral history, rather recorded one, that's, and people have, and we've talked about terms and like, okay, how does a person feel about it existing in the collections? And they've been like, well, I want it to be here, but I also maybe want it to be at this different sort of archive place. Or specifically in the example I'm giving, this person was like, I'm happy for it to exist here, but I also want it to exist at the George Padmore Institute, which is, you know, a small grassroots like bookshop and archive. And I think it's what I'm quite is basically institutions, right? And like how they, yeah, I don't know, I'm saying many things, but I'm just wondering about how you've thought or reflected on ownership, specifically big institutions that tend to like have their own systems around recording stuff, preserving stuff, and like, yeah, creating different
sharing it, making it accessible.
I would probably start off by talking about issues of copyright, because this is something which in fact we should have mentioned earlier on, that you can't really do anything unless you have copyright. So you have to have a copyright agreement with the person who is donating their story, who's telling their story, otherwise you're stealing it. So first of all, as an institution, whoever is doing the recording, and in our case, we're an institution which is outside of any particular archive, but then we archive it. We tell the person what we're going to do with it. We tell them all the various possibilities that it may be used. We even warned them that their aunt in Australia may hear this the next day, because we could put it online. We never do. I wish we could do it so quickly as that, but we kind of give them a due warning so they know what's going to happen. So there's that aspect of the copyright agreement. When we actually archive it, we come to an agreement. For example, we came to an agreement with the National Library of Scotland that when we archive materials there, we don't lose the ability to use it ourselves. So we can carry on doing the podcast and so forth. So there's that already, a shared ownership between ourselves, the institution where it's being archived. And actually, let's remember the person who did it in the first place, because they we record their words and the recording belongs to us, but they can use exactly the same words. They can write a book about it. They can publish a book about it. We can never come back and say you've broken copyright. They don't lose copyright by doing that. That's part of the copyright agreement. And the final thing you talk about is in terms of institutional greed, really, or this is ours and nobody else is going to have it. We have found that particularly not with museums and archives, I should say, but actually with universities. Universities can, and I come from a university background, I worked in one for 31 years. I know what they're like, and their ethics committees can be so unethical, because in the end, what they can say is, oh no, you're not having this. We'll record you, but we're going to keep it, and we shall then destroy it. And if you say, no, I'm sorry, this is something where we are giving our time, we're giving freely of our time, we're talking about our experience, and what are you saying? You're going to lock this away, have it for yourselves, and then destroy it? No, I'm not going to play that game. So you can see that I'm kind of quite annoyed by that. I have more recently asked National Library of Scotland, is it all right if people in Moray, in the north of Scotland, archive material locally as well? So we would have a digital copy in National Library of Scotland and a digital copy used locally. And the answer was positive, it was fine.
Yeah.
But it's the kind of thing you may have to ask. And with digital materials, this is not a problem. Often archives are distributed these days. I already said that we have our materials in at least three different places. Not a problem. All you need is a good index. You have to have an index that people can go to and find where they can find things. And again, we work with National Library of Scotland in this, and we have there an index of research materials on LGBT lives, and anybody working in Scotland can upload to them or get in contact with them or with us, and we would be an intermediary to get in contact with them and say, I have these materials, they're archived in this particular library or museum somewhere, and we would like to be included in your website because it's a significant research resource. So all of those things you need, but yes, institutions can sometimes be greedy, but university is the worst example.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think the index kind of a point is really, really important, because I think it's like acknowledging that like the essence of these histories and stories and it's never like centralized. It's never meant to just be, and like also, it's big,
I think that's another point that we are like, you get that those people who believe in history with a capital H, but we're much more about the histories. There's loads of different intertwined histories, all different, and it's about acknowledging them all and seeing how they interrelate and connect, and that's kind of what you're talking about. It sounds almost like it's like Captain Hindsight, like that's we have to get. I'm looking at our copyright, it's 4 pages long, it's thorough. We go through it before, we go through it after, because we've had 20 years of getting it right and to make sure that nothing like this comes up. And that's like what James said about universities. People will give their stories to researchers, PhDs, masters, but they don't always appreciate that that will just be destroyed, right? And then it's gone. If you want to given it, and it's not the same to recreate that. And like James said, it's usually for us, it's universities who will not want to share copyright. Other institutions love it because they want the same. They want to have this, like you're saying, the interconnectedness and networks. They want this. But I find that.
Yeah, I mean, just to finish up, I think it's also about making that like an option for people, because again, people don't often think it's an option, and I think it should be like in this conversation around accessibility and ownership. Yeah, I think it's because I'm obviously learning to have it in different ways, but I think it's about saying that if there's other places you'd like to see this exist, just let us know. So yeah.
A lot of our interviewees ask for a copy of their own interview. They want, they can have that email to them and they can download it. A lot ask for that, and well, what they do with that's their business. We can't tell them otherwise. That's not how it works, sort of thing. But yeah, I don't have a problem with that, obviously.
Okay.
For those who want to model, if you don't have copyright forms already, then many of you I think would already be familiar with that. The Oral History Society has very good model for that, so you could base it on there.
Very good.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
That's great. Thank you for that question, actually. As you can see, you're running a bit over. I have said in the chat that this is being recorded and you can catch up later on if you do have to zoom off. And also all the links that are in the chat will also be available for everyone to look at later on. I just want to say one more question. Fergal, I've asked if you'd like to ask it because it's about archiving and it's about archiving your social media. Is this something that OurStory Scotland do, and have you got any sort of practical advice for anyone?
We've been talking about this a lot,
Yes.
and have kind of thought about, there was all the whole apocalyptic Twitter scene for a wee while, and thinking about members of our community who are no longer with us, who have got maybe a decade's worth of tweets that you can download their Twitter archive. And then we're looking again, we're going to approach, I'm sure the National Library will attach that to, say, like Derek Ogg is a good example. He had a really good Twitter account that is a record of, I think, maybe the last 10 years of his life, really. So that would be really important to download that as an archive and have it. But digital conservative, that's not my thing. I would need to look into that again, see who to connect with, go through all the queer networks. On you go, James. But yeah,
No, I'm just going to say the National Library of Scotland have been very encouraging on this. Again, it's not our own particular expertise, it's more their expertise. We are not ourselves archivists. We are people who are collecting and knowing which archive to put them into, but they do that kind of work. But they've encouraged us in a couple of ways I can give you examples of. One would be our old website. It's an old, messy website. We're developing a new one, but they would like to also have that old website. And there are things which won't have a place in the new one. So it's important that that is archived. So that's something they will archive. So it's that kind of thing that they are concerned with, making sure that it's there. Sorry, go ahead.
Like what we've done today, we all came together in an intangible space. So we've done a couple of things. We have the transgressions. That's a record that we all came together and we shared this experience. Jonah, that's listening, is going to put a little zine together about today. Again, that's another record that we all came together, and it's a record that we can archive of this intangible space. How many group chats are you in with your queer friends or your colleagues? That's a space that you've used and inhabited that tells a story in itself of a group of people that have come together. These things have value. So don't you go?
And also podcasts, your podcasts, the podcast we put forward as part of childhoods, the library is going to archive those. So they will be archived as well. Even though they are not the original recordings, they are extracts which have been put together in a new form, but they will record that too.
Yeah.
Okay, I really am going to have to, that's us gone way over, but I do just want to say a big thank you to our speakers, to Dom and to Jaime